You are now tuned in to the Storm Tracker podcast.
Welcome back, family, to the Storm Tracker podcast. I'm Marcus Benjamin, representing for CanesCounty.com, part of the Rivals.com network. Make sure you subscribe to this podcast, the Storm Tracker podcast, on all platforms, tracking the storm that is the Miami Hurricanes. And today I have John Garcia, National Recruiting Analyst for Rivals.com, to talk a little Hurricanes recruiting. Big month coming up with official visits. So wanted to tap in with my guy, John, to get his opinion on some of the visitors that will be traveling down south to Coral Gables within the next upcoming weeks. Thanks for joining me today, John.
Always a pleasure, my guy.
Absolutely. So a lot of big name talent coming down to South Florida in the next upcoming weeks. And the highest rated guy, as we saw yesterday with the Rivals 5-star countdown, was DJ Pickett, the outstanding safety from the Tampa Bay area. Pickett is the 9th rated player in the entire country for the 2025 class. But there are some other contenders, right? LSU is in the mix, as well as some others. But Miami seems to be trending in the right direction to land Pickett. But in your opinion, just how do you see this thing playing out with the 5-star safety?
Yeah, I see it as a two-horse race. You mentioned Miami, in terms of the in-state schools, the Canes have done the best job, simply. They've gotten them on campus the most. They've prioritized them the most. And it looks like they've got the best shot relative to Florida of keeping Pickett within state lines. So I really view LSU as the primary competition. Now, he's said Oregon is higher than people realize. He's got Georgia on his list. We mentioned the Florida Gators as well, which is the closest school to home. But really, this feels like, do you roll with the Canes, or does LSU start to really build momentum and try to get back to that DBU moniker that they once held? Every time he visits LSU, my sources up in Tampa say, hey, the Tigers are going to be tough to beat in this battle. But as you said pre-show, when he visits Miami, it just seems like he's already comfortable on campus. He's obviously got family ties with Booker Pickett on that roster. We know Mario Cristobal is headlining this thing, and when he's personally involved, especially with Big Fish, we know how that typically tilts towards the Hurricanes. So this is a heavyweight deal. Now, what makes this one just as interesting as some of the others is that DJ is very reserved. He's not going to let a whole lot out, and he's going to take visits to all these schools coming up, on the official visit slate. So I do think there's still some potential wiggle room one way or the other between these two schools. Or, can one of these other schools make up ground from the back of the pack? I mean, nothing is impossible in this day and age of NIL and really, impromptu decisions. And then that's the secondary factor. Does DJ follow that classic timeline and take the officials, then make a decision? Or does this leak into the season? And I think when you've got such a national list, I do think there's a little bit more likelihood that it does potentially leak into the season. He might be saying, hey, I want to see what Miami does on the field. I want to see what Florida does on the field compared to some of the other programs that might be more established in that regard. So I think that's where I'm at with it. I feel like it's Miami, LSU, curious about that decision timeline. But let's be honest, even if he is a summer decider, that recruitment's not going to be over until National Signing Day. He's too talented. You see the highlights right here. Legitimately 6'4 plus with freaky athleticism and ball skills, to the point that some of these schools are talking about him playing corner at that size, which is something literally non-existent in the NFL today. There is not a corner that big in the league, but some of these college programs, high-level blue bloods, think DJ's got that type of rare athleticism where he can occupy the boundary despite being just so darn tall.
Yeah, I mean, what jumps out to me on this highlights that we're watching of DJ Pickett is his speed, man. He's got outstanding speed, and if you got a rangy guy like that with length, I mean, you kind of see why he's so coveted and why he's ranked so high in the rivals rankings. I think Cristobal is going to make sure that everything is kind of thrown at him to land him during these official visits. And I think Miami's in a good spot, but I think Miami's in a good spot with damn near every top recruit that's on their board. So we saw it last year with the Justin Scotts of the world and Armando Blunts and Marquise Lightfoot, who obviously ended up being a 5-star late in the game. That when Miami wants a big name, they definitely do whatever they can to land said guy. So it will definitely be an interesting recruitment from this point forward. And I totally agree with you. I think even if he does commit to the Hurricanes, he's still a player to watch throughout this recruiting cycle to see if he signs with the Canes. Another player that there have been, I guess, maybe questions about if he will sign with the Canes eventually is someone who's actually committed to the Miami Hurricanes, and that's Elijah Melendez. This guy is an absolute freak of a player, and he draws comparisons to Ray Lewis from those on the coaching staff. So obviously he's a guy that Miami wants to keep. But you spoke to him recently, John, and he, revealed his official visit list of Auburn, Oklahoma, and Michigan. So, based on your conversation with him, how do you feel as far as him sticking with the Hurricanes throughout this recruiting cycle?
Look, Miami has survived several visits thus far, right? I mean, this kid is originally from Colorado, and he's been out to Coach Prime and has stuck with Miami since that verbal commitment was made. He's been to Ole Miss, and he's been up to Michigan. And, that's really the school. If you have to look at the top threat, I think it's UM versus UM. I think Michigan, Big Ten production at that position at the NFL level, and obviously coming off of a national championship, despite that coaching staff, really overhauling and looking very different going forward, that's really appealing, to Elijah. So it's a bit of a contrast with Miami in that regard. But look, he keeps saying it. Miami's home. That's really what he kept hammering when we spoke this week. Miami's home. The Canes are going to get the last official visit. So I think, Auburn and Oklahoma are definitely gonna have their shot, but it's really that Michigan trip, which is a return visit. And he took that first visit over multiple days. That return visit to Ann Arbor, to me, is the one Miami fans should have circled. Again, it's going to go down before the Miami official visit goes down. So I don't expect any, commitments or decommitments during those trips. But he definitely wants to be settled. He was talking about many other schools beyond these four at different points. USC, we mentioned Colorado, Ole Miss, a bunch of other schools were trying to gain some footing with Melendez, but really he wanted to lock in a few officials, give others a chance, including Miami, to really see where he's at going into his senior season. So Oklahoma is totally new for him. He's never been, so that is very much to be determined in terms of their chances to pull what would be considered a pretty big upset. Auburn has hosted him in the past. I think that SEC appeal is what it is. It's very apparent. We all know what that conference has been able to do. But again, Michigan is the one that I'd keep my closest eye on relative to, any worry of losing out on this Melendez verbal commitment. But again, he loves Miami. He calls it home. He's now in Orlando. So he's a Floridian. He's bought into that Florida boy swag, that whole deal. So Miami in that regard really does fit. And that's a position where we've seen Miami in this cycle very calculated. So I do think for Miami to have him so high on the board does say a lot. And as you mentioned, the comparisons have been kind of wild with
Yeah.
Melendez, but he's a bullet, man. He's 6'2", 225. He's chiseled. I mean, I just saw a video where he's benching 405. This is a freak. You said it, Marcus. This is a freak of nature, not the type of backer that comes along every single cycle, because he's got explosiveness to go along with it and clear pop, upon contact. So you can see him as a blitzer, you can see him rushing the passer, and you certainly can see him working downhill and setting the tone against the running back. And he buys into all of that. So I think the long-standing status of this Miami commitment is going to hold weight. But again, Michigan offers something that Miami doesn't at the moment. So I do think the Wolverines are the program to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the other is a bit concerning just because, of that visit that he had. It seemed like they hit it out of the park with him, and, a return trip right before he returns to Miami is a bit concerning. But I think the key factor here is that the fact that Miami has the last visit. I think the lasting impression, as well as anybody, is probably the most important. That last visit usually means, okay, well, they've got the last impression, and they have the best shot. And the fact that he's committed, of course, helps a lot as well. So that is definitely another recruitment that we'll watch. And Canes County, as well as Rivals.com, will have the latest on his recruitment as we learn more. He's not the only in-state guy, of course, that Miami is targeting. There's plenty of in-state guys that will be officially visiting this June. You got guys like Ezekiel Marcelin and Cortez Mills and CJ Ewald, Joshua Moore. I mean, the list kind of goes on and on here as far as in-state players. But there's kind of always a player that Miami feels like they must get for one of the cycles. It was Ruben Bain. Felt like that was like the must get player,
Yeah.
and obviously we saw why on the field last year. So for you, John, who do you think is really kind of the must get player that Miami needs to keep home?
Yeah, that's a great question. This cycle in South Florida, it's a bit different. I think there's not that bona fide, hey, this is the clear Jeremiah Smith #1 guy in South Florida. I feel like it's up for debate, but right now the top ranked player in South Florida is CJ Ewald, right? He's the top defensive back down here, and overall recruit currently on Rivals. I think Bryce Fitzgerald's closing that gap, and both are heavy Miami targets, but we know CJ's coming off the board in less than a month. June 27th, his birthday, that is when he's coming off the board. And similar to Elijah Melendez, despite, not being currently committed to Miami, it's a handful of schools, but really there's 2 or 3 that are going to get trips that are worth keeping an eye on beyond the Miami Hurricanes. Now, I will say that the Canes are the favorite going into these trips. No doubt about it in my mind. I think really from even before he decommitted from Michigan to bring the Wolverines back into it, Miami was always the school. Like, what is Miami's play going to be for CJ? And now that he's got the official visits lined up, I'm very curious to see how those work out. I think Louisville is an interesting contender. We know what the Cardinals have done in South Florida. I mean, every kid you talk to has that offer that's got, some star power by his name, and they're putting their money where their mouth is with NIL over the last couple of cycles. So Louisville's not to be, I guess, underestimated. And then there's a couple SEC trips that CJ will take that are fascinating. Georgia's on the list. Auburn's on the list. Again, 2 more programs that have recruited the state very well. What is the priority status with him and Georgia? How does that work? We know, T-Rob is there, who's always recruited South Florida very well. And Georgia's Georgia, right? I think with Nick Saban retiring, I think we can probably say when that G logo comes up, it's got the most weight right now in college football. So, that is never to be overlooked. So curious to see from Georgia's perspective how high on the board Ewald is. But we know with Miami, he's sky high on there. Whether he is a nickel, a true corner, maybe even a safety down the line, that determination can still be out there. But we know Miami's extremely high on Ewald, and I think he's a guy, especially with the Chaminade Madonna ties, that they absolutely have to keep home. Again, I'm close to putting Fitzgerald in that boat, but today Ewald's the highest ranked in South Florida. He's a cornerback, a premium position guy, and he's at a premium program at Chaminade Madonna. All of those things lined up very well, of course, for Miami.
And of course, Miami wants to continue that pipeline from Chaminade Madonna. I mean, last cycle, they were able to get JoJo Trader and Zaquan Patterson. If they can continue to build that pipeline from Chaminade, one of the powerhouses in South Florida, that always will bode well for the Miami Hurricanes for this cycle and for future cycles where, that team is consistently loaded. It's actually a young team this year. CJ Ewald is one of the veterans on that squad. So if they can get him, then they can continue the pipelines that they have going with Chaminade, Central, American Heritage. So we'll see if they continue to build that pipeline from one of South Florida's best. So there are some players that, like CJ Ewald, I don't think would be a huge surprise if they landed him. I think Miami's the favorite there, but there are some players that Miami has landed in the past two cycles who are surprises. Like, whoa, okay. They got this player, Justin Scott, definitely being one of them, I think, from the last cycle. And like this weekend, you've got players like Eric Winters, outstanding hybrid safety out of Alabama. And you've got players like Zion Grady as well from the same high school at Enterprise, Alabama. And you've got, a couple of other players from outside of the country outside of the state that will be visiting Miami, like Dimitri Manning, who I really like a lot from Washington, the state, also visiting. So there will be some surprises here. Who do you think is going to be the surprise recruit that Miami lands? It could be, in your region, whether it be Alabama or Florida or outside of your territory. Who do you think is the big surprise that will raise some eyebrows?
Yeah, I was going to say, are they recruiting anybody from Chicago? Because apparently that is a new Miami pipeline.
Daniel Marshall is that one guy.
Yeah, that might be the starting point every cycle with what Miami wants to do. I think it's pretty early to nail that down, but like you said, a lot of these out-of-staters are setting these official visits, and things can change quickly on these trips. I think for Justin Scott, you mentioned last cycle, it felt like he took a multiple-day unofficial visit early on that really put Miami at the forefront of his recruitment, and then they sealed the deal with that official visit. So it could be a situation brewing like that. And I like those Bama guys you mentioned. I think Andrew Purcell is another one to keep an eye on. They all go to Enterprise High School. So if there's one high school Miami fans should keep an eye on, it's Enterprise High School down in the southern part of the state. Interesting group. You mentioned Winters, hybrid safety linebacker. I think he's maybe the wild card of that group. He does the most things. So I think his recruitment has the most, I guess, ceiling or room to kind of go crazy. He played quarterback. We ranked him as a linebacker. Everyone thought he was going to be a linebacker. He shows up to Rivals Atlanta camp playing safety, and he wins MVP. He has like 4 interceptions. And now all of a sudden he says, hey, all the top schools on my list want me as a safety. So how does that change, I guess, the priority level for a guy like Eric Winters? So he's a little bit too tough to call, in my opinion. I think Zion Grady is one Miami fans really need to keep an eye on. He's an edge rusher who needs development, long and lean. You know where I'm going with this. Jason Taylor is on that coaching staff looking for pass rushers to develop. And Grady has really reset his recruitment. He was a Bama commit. Obviously, Saban retired, and he really took a step back and is starting from scratch. At that moment, when he decommitted, we thought Georgia was going to be the school because that was the school battling Alabama on the front end. And he's like, no, Georgia's not really in it. And we know Bama's new group is sort of not really in it. So I think when you get premium position prospects who totally are wide open in the process, a program like Miami can present especially well at this stage of the game. So I think, look, it's a heavyweight battle. We know Auburn is in it. We know Miami's at the forefront. Ohio State is kind of the dark horse that has recently started to push for Grady. But I think the
Right.
positioning of Miami having already hosted him and now getting him back on campus for the official visit, I think that's a guy that Canes fans should maybe keep an eye on. He's one that I wouldn't be shocked to see jump on the commitment list at some point, and that would profile as just as big a get as a Lightfoot or somebody bigger like that over the last several cycles, because this is a guy who was locked in. This was a recruitment that was considered over, just a few months ago. So those are the type of battles that you hire a Mario Cristobal to go out and win. Go pull off some kind of upset, and this isn't a kid in South Alabama, right? He's not in Birmingham. He's not that close to Tuscaloosa or Athens, Georgia, or any of these places where it feels impossible to go out and win a battle. This is a kid in Enterprise. He's a little bit closer to Auburn or even Florida State. So I think the fact that he's wide open, he's going to take these trips. He's obviously, got the pedigree, and he's got Jason Taylor coming after him. I think that combination is going to, at a minimum, keep Miami right in the forefront of this game.
Yeah, absolutely. Zion Grady, one of the talents that will be visiting this weekend. And Miami has yet to, in the Cristobal era, land a player after the first weekend. So it'll be interesting to see if they get a commit right after this first official weekend. And I agree with you. I think Zion Grady is a player definitely to watch. When I last spoke to him, he said that it was one of the greatest environments that he's been around, and plus the fact that he'd be developed by a former Hall of Famer and Jason Taylor always is a plus. So they have a really big chance to impress Grady again this weekend. Let's see if they impress him enough to where he commits after the weekend, because he's got a couple of official visits after Miami as well. It's always tough, I think, to get a player to commit after the first weekend when they have others lined up. They kind of want to, see their options before making a decision. So that's definitely a player to watch, but there's other players as well that will be visiting this weekend. Players like Byron Lewis, Zika Marcelin, like I mentioned, Andrew Purcell, like you mentioned, Tyler Williams is a player that is a very interesting prospect as well. Wide receiver out at Sumner. Sumner all of a sudden is a juggernaut, producing high-level players. And we also talked about Winters and Wilkerson, who was kind of a late bloomer here as far as the recruiting scene is concerned. That guy fits the mold of what Miami usually brings in. I don't like to call players projects, but he is a player that Miami can certainly develop, who it has been underrated in this recruiting process. And I spoke to him as well when he was down here. He loved it. Of course, like all players do when they come to South Florida, especially for the first time. But of all the players, especially the in-state guys, what do you think are the chances that Miami does land like one of these guys after this first official visit weekend?
Yeah, I think that's the group that you focus on, right? The guys who are sort of familiar and certainly closer to home. So, any of those Miami area guys, Marcelin, Mari Wallace, Picard, Orlando guys like Wilkerson, any of those, I think could possibly pop as soon as this weekend. Because I think there's a clear understanding of where they sit. I mean, how long has Miami been recruiting Ezekiel Marcelin? 2-3 years at this point. So, I think there's not a whole lot for a guy like that to learn about the program. So I think I've got an eye on him to some degree. Byron Lewis is fascinating. I think this
Yeah.
is going to be a Sunshine State battle between the Canes and the Noles up in Tallahassee. And depending on who you talk to or when you talk to them, one program is trending versus the other. I've long had the sense that he was Miami's to lose, but Florida State has certainly made up ground, no matter how you slice it, in recent weeks and months. So I think that battle could be a huge one, and I think he'll take both officials before settling on that verbal commitment. Wisconsin's involved. I don't want to disrespect the Badgers. I am wearing their colors today, but I think this one stays in state at the end of the day. And a lot of these guys are South Floridians that we're talking about. So I do think if there's someone who's going to commit week one and say screw these other visits, it's probably going to be a kid from Dade or Broward County. I think that's a little bit more likely. I do think Wilkerson's fascinating, though. We've seen, if there's one position where we've seen Miami kind of go get their guys, it's been along the offensive line, which makes sense with
Sure.
Cristobal and Alex Mirabal. So I do think that Wilkerson could be the type to end up at Miami. And the competition is not as steep as some of these other guys that we've talked about. Syracuse is involved, Rutgers is involved, UCF, maybe USF, so if you're a Miami fan, you like those odds competing
Sure.
against those schools than for, like a Zion Grady, where it's, SEC and ACC heavyweight. So I do think that wouldn't surprise me as well. And I get the sense they're going to grab one of these guys sooner rather than later. Miami is understanding of momentum in recruiting. They're understanding of the game that perception plays in recruiting. So I think with a list that I believe is into the double digits, you're not going to miss on all these guys coming out of the gates. But you mentioned Tyler Williams, and I wanted to touch on him for a second. Wide receiver is fascinating. We think Miami is going to take a smaller number, maybe 2, maybe 3, but we know they're being picky, which I think is great, right? I mean, elite programs are picky, right? Very selective. I guess that's the PC word to use. Very selective in how they're courting these receivers. And as well as anyone, Marcus, the state is absolutely loaded at wide receiver in this cycle. You mentioned Cortez Mills from Homestead. You've got Dallas Wilson up in Tampa, who's committed to Oregon that they love. I mean, what about Javon Boggs, Tyler Williams, you mentioned from Sumner. I mean, the group just really goes on forever. Vernell Brown from Orlando. If the number is small, and Wade and Charles is currently committed right now, if the number is small, how does that factor in to the pecking order of these guys? Where does Joshua Moore sit? I mean, few are bigger and more impressive physically than the Pembroke Pines native. So I do think that receiver is going to be one of the more fascinating spots. You kind of know, hey, no matter who the group is, it's going to be good because these are all 4-star guys. But do you say no to a Dade County guy? What about Nashawn Montgomery? As we get more names in here, do you say no to a Dade County guy or Broward County guy in favor of Tampa, Orlando, Jacksonville, etc.? I don't think so. But when we're talking about a program being selective, you just never know. And Tyler, ironically, who's maybe the newest name of most of these big names we've been talking about, he might be the furthest away from making a decision. So you could look at that one of two ways. You could say, well, Miami can kind of gain some footing and hold on to it for him because they're going to play the long game and see where these other dominoes fall. Or you could look at it on the other end and say, if Miami misses on some of these guys, this is not a bad guy to circle back around to because he's incredibly impressive on the hoof. I saw him for the first time at OT7 just a couple of weeks ago. Legitimate 6'2", right around 200 pounds right now. And you see what he's doing on Friday nights, going up and getting the football, which is what you want to see, in this state of Florida where the competition is heavy at any metro area. And Tampa certainly included in that. So Tyler Williams could be a funky wrinkle into the wide receiver mix for the Canes, but I kind of look at it like, while it's fascinating, no matter how that group shakes out, it's probably going to be pretty darn good at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the more fascinating position groups that Miami is working. Joshua Moore, I think Miami's in a great spot, for him and yeah, in order to, you know, have a Tyler Williams take up a spot on this recruiting commitment list. It really will be interesting, and Miami's in a great spot, literally, as far as location is concerned, that they can be picky as far as when it comes to wide receivers. So Tyler Williams visiting this weekend. You've got players like Vernell Brown, Jamie French, and Cortez Mills, just off the top of my head, that will also be officially visiting Miami within the next month as well. So it feels like one of these receivers will come off the board in the next couple of weeks. The question is just who, and that's why we do recruiting, right? I mean, that's why recruiting is so fascinating, is because of those type of questions. So that's going to wrap it up for the Storm Tracker podcast. Make sure you subscribe to this podcast on all platforms as well. Thank you, John, for joining me for another great pod. And of course, we'll see you again soon, my guy.
Thank you.
Once again, make sure you subscribe to this podcast on all platforms, the Storm Tracker podcast, tracking the storm that is the Miami Hurricanes. And also subscribe to this YouTube channel live from Canes County. Until the next episode.